The screams never happened. That's the truth no one wants to hear, because for centuries we've been haunted by the image of a woman-shaped coffin lined with iron spikes, waiting. We've imagined the condemned being sealed inside, the door closing inch by inch, the spikes piercing flesh slowly, methodically, as blood pooled in the darkness and life drained away in agony. We've built entire museums around this terror. We've written it into history books. We've whispered about it in hushed tones, grateful we live in gentler times. But the Iron Maiden, as we know it, is a lie, not a medieval instrument of torture, not a relic of the Inquisition, not even a forgotten cruelty from humanity's darkest ages. The Iron Maiden is something far more disturbing than that. It's a fabrication, a theatrical prop, a Victorian fever dream dressed up as medieval horror and sold to a public hungry for darkness they could safely consume from a distance. And yet, the screams persist. Because the truth behind the Iron Maiden isn't about what happened inside its hollow body. It's about why we needed it to exist at all. It's about what we project onto the past when we're too afraid to examine the present. It's about the real tortures we ignore while fixating on the ones we invented. This is the story of a monster that was never real, and the very real darkness that created it. The year is 1793, Nuremberg, Germany. The old medieval city, thick with shadows and stone, is about to birth a legend. In the depths of the city's subterranean passages, among genuine relics of judicial punishment and public execution, something new appears. A cabinet. Tall, imposing, shaped vaguely like a human figure. When opened, its interior reveals a nightmare. Dozens of iron spikes positioned to pierce the body of anyone trapped inside. A face is carved into the door. A woman's face, cold and expressionless, watching. The curator calls it the Iron Maiden, der Eiserne Jungfrau. He tells visitors it's medieval, perhaps from the 14th century, perhaps older. He speaks of heretics and witches, of confessions extracted through unimaginable pain, of bodies found inside with puncture wounds so numerous they looked like sieves. The tourists line in, horrified and fascinated. They pay their admission. They return home with stories that will be retold in parlors and written into books. But there's no documentation, no trial records mentioning it, no execution logs, no period illustrations showing its use, no contemporary accounts from the supposed era of its employment, because it didn't exist then. The Iron Maiden of Nuremberg was built in the late 18th century, possibly as late as the 1790s. It was constructed not as a torture device, but as a tourist attraction. A piece of dark theater designed to capitalize on the Romantic era's obsession with medieval barbarism. And it worked. By the early 1800s, the legend had taken root. Travel writers mentioned it. Historians referenced it without verification. Artists illustrated it in lurid detail. The Iron Maiden began appearing in other museums, other cities, each claiming their version was authentic, each adding embellishments to the story. Some said the spikes were positioned to avoid vital organs, prolonging the agony for days. Others claimed the device was hollow beneath, allowing executioners to stand below and hear the victim's final prayers. None of it was true, but truth in this case was optional. The Iron Maiden had become something more powerful than a historical artifact. It had become a symbol, a condensed representation of everything the 19th century wanted to believe about the medieval period, that it was savage, superstitious, cruel beyond measure, that we had evolved past such darkness. That progress was linear and our modern sensibilities proof of our moral superiority. The irony would be almost funny if it weren't so disturbing. Because while the Iron Maiden was being constructed as a museum piece, real torture was thriving. The same century that built fake medieval torture devices was perfecting actual systematic brutality. Colonial powers were subjugating entire continents through violence that would make any fictional torture device pale in comparison. Slavery was operating at industrial scale. Public executions were still common entertainment. Workhouses were grinding up the poor. Prisons were experiments in human degradation. But those horrors were contemporary, they were uncomfortable. They implicated the viewer. The Iron Maiden, however, the Iron Maiden was safe, it was distant, it allowed people to feel horrified without feeling responsible. It let them believe darkness was something that belonged to the past, to other people, to ages we had transcended. This is the first truth the Iron Maiden teaches us. We create the monsters we need to believe in. Let's examine what we actually know about medieval torture. The historical record is clear. Judicial torture existed. It was legal in many European jurisdictions from roughly the 13th through the 18th centuries. It was regulated, documented, and used primarily for one purpose: extracting confessions. The rack, the strappado, thumb screws, water torture. These were real. They were employed by legal authorities following specific procedures, however horrific those procedures were. But here's what the historical record also shows. Torture was not the carnival of sadistic invention that popular imagination suggests. It was bureaucratic, methodical, often limited by law in duration and intensity. Judges had to be present, documentation was required. There were rules about who could be tortured and under what circumstances, not because medieval society was merciful, but because torture was seen as a legal tool, not entertainment. Its goal was utility, not creativity. The elaborate mechanized torture devices that fill museums and haunted houses, most of them are modern fabrications or extreme exaggerations of simple restraint devices. The Iron Maiden is just the most famous example, the pear of anguish. Likely a speculum used for medical examinations, later reinterpreted as a torture device. The breast ripper, no historical documentation of use, probably created for 19th century exhibitions. The Judas cradle, mentioned in a few sources but vastly exaggerated in mechanical complexity. The Spanish donkey. A military punishment device, yes, but not the spike-covered monstrosity depicted in museums. What we think we know about medieval torture is largely Victorian Gothic fantasy projected backward, and the Iron Maiden is its crown jewel. But where did the name come from? Why Iron Maiden? Some claim it references the Virgin Mary, a blasphemous inversion of the merciful mother into an instrument of death. Others suggest it derives from a German execution legend, possibly conflated with other punishments. The truth is murkier. There was in medieval Germany a punishment called Die Jungfer. The Virgin, but it wasn't a spiked cabinet. It was a term for a dungeon or a restraining device, possibly a simple standing cell. Over time, through mistranslation, misunderstanding, and deliberate embellishment, it transformed. By the time the Nuremberg device was built, the name had already accumulated layers of dark mythology. The creators didn't invent the name. They materialized it. They gave physical form to a legend that had been growing in whispers and warnings. They built what people already believed existed. This is how myths become real, not through history but through belief given shape. The most famous Iron Maiden stood in the Nuremberg castle until 1944. That year, Allied bombing destroyed much of the city. The original Iron Maiden was lost in the destruction, along with countless actual historical artifacts. But by then, it didn't matter. The Iron Maiden had already reproduced. Copies existed in museums across Europe and America. Each claimed authenticity. Each told the same story with minor variations. The device had become self-replicating, spreading not through historical documentation but through cultural fascination. In the 20th century, the Iron Maiden migrated from museums into popular culture. It appeared in horror films, in heavy metal album covers, in Halloween attractions. It became shorthand for medieval cruelty, instantly recognizable, requiring no explanation. The Iron Maiden tribute band needed no other justification for their name. Is everyone knew what it meant, and with each repetition, the lie became more embedded, more real than reality. Here's what makes the Iron Maiden truly disturbing. It tells us something about ourselves we'd rather not acknowledge. We want to believe in this kind of evil. We need it to exist in specific forms at specific distances. The Iron Maiden is perfectly calibrated darkness, horrific enough to produce a thrill, historical enough to avoid guilt, mechanical enough to seem alien to our modern sensibilities. It lets us believe that cruelty requires elaborate devices and theatrical staging, that it's something done by others long ago in castles and dungeons, that we would recognize it if we saw it, that we would never participate. But the truth is uglier. Real cruelty is often banal, bureaucratic, systemic. It doesn't require spiked cabinets. It happens in forms so mundane we barely notice, in laws that seem reasonable, in procedures that appear necessary, in systems that operate smoothly, efficiently, with clean hands and proper documentation. The Nazis didn't build Iron Maidens. They built an industrial apparatus of death that processed millions with mechanical efficiency. The gulags didn't need medieval devices. They had cold, starvation, and labor. Modern torture relies on stress positions, sensory deprivation, psychological manipulation, methods that leave few marks and require no elaborate contraptions. The real horror isn't the spiked cabinet. It's what we do without one. Let's talk about the museums that still display Iron Maidens. Many have added disclaimers now. Small plaques acknowledging that the authenticity is disputed, that these devices may be later constructions, that the historical record is unclear. But they keep them on display. Why? Because people want to see them, because they draw crowds, because they satisfy something in us that demands physical manifestation of evil. We want evil to look like something. To have a shape we can point to and say, there, that is darkness and we are standing in the light. The museums understand this. They're giving us what we need. A containable horror, a historical safe word, a way to feel the thrill of darkness without the responsibility of proximity. But there's a cost to this. Every time we fixate on the Iron Maiden, we're looking away from something real. Every time we shudder at medieval barbarism, we're granting ourselves moral amnesty. Every time we thank modernity for saving us from such darkness, we're refusing to see the darkness that surrounds us. The Iron Maiden is a monument to our willful blindness. In 2003, the Medieval Crime Museum in Rothenburg, Germany, one of the world's largest collections of judicial punishment devices, published research definitively showing that their Iron Maiden was a 19th century construction. They could trace its creation to a specific workshop. They could document when it was added to the collection. They could prove conclusively that it was never used for torture. The museum could have removed it. They didn't. They moved it to a section on torture myths and added extensive historical context. But the device remains, still photographed thousands of times daily, still the centerpiece of countless tourist experiences, still doing its work. Because the Iron Maiden was never really about history. It was about narrative, about giving shape to our fears and our need for progress. About creating a past dark enough to make our present seem bright by comparison. And that narrative is that we still need. There's a philosophical question buried in the Iron Maiden's hollow chest. If we invent a torture we never actually used, is that better or worse than using tortures we won't admit to? The Iron Maiden is a confession of sorts. It reveals what we believe we're capable of, what we think our ancestors did, what we imagine humans can become. It's a portrait of evil painted not by victims or perpetrators, but by spectators. It's evil as entertainment, as history, as cautionary tale, but not as present reality. Real torture doesn't get museums, it gets euphemisms. Enhanced interrogation, coercive questioning, stress positions. It gets legal memos arguing about definitions, it gets classified, it gets denied, dismissed, defended. The Iron Maiden, by contrast, gets field trips. Children are brought to see it, to learn about the Dark Ages, to understand how far we've come. And they leave believing they've witnessed genuine history, genuine darkness, genuine horror, never knowing they've been shown a mirror disguised as a window. Let me tell you about the real coffin of screams. It wasn't made of iron, it wasn't lined with spikes, it wasn't in a castle, it was a ship's hold packed so tight that bodies formed a living mass. It was a train car sealed for days in summer heat. It was a prison cell designed to break minds before bodies. It was a psychiatric institution where patients were forgotten. It was a factory where workers died for productivity. It was a border where children were separated from parents. It was 1,000 places and times where suffering was systematic, efficient, and justified by those who perpetrated it. The real coffin of screams is never on display. It's never labeled. It's often not even visible. It's the space between what we claim to believe and what we actually do. It's the gap between the horrors we condemn in history and the horrors we tolerate in policy. It's the distance between the evil we can imagine and the evil we can't recognize when it wears a uniform, speaks in legal language, or operates with proper authorization. The Iron Maiden lets us fill that coffin with someone else's screams. Medieval screams, fictional screams, safely distant screams. But the real screams are contemporary. They're just harder to hear when we're too busy looking at museum pieces. Here's the final twist in the Iron Maiden's dark story. Even knowing it's fake, we can't quite let it go. I've told you the truth. I've shown you the evidence. I've traced the construction, the timeline, the fabrication. You know now that the Iron Maiden is a Victorian stage prop, that no medieval victim ever died inside one, that the entire mythology is manufactured. And yet, when you picture it, when you imagine that hollow metal form with spikes waiting in the darkness, when you think about the door closing, you still feel something: dread, horror, fascination. The lie has power even after it's revealed. This is perhaps the Iron Maiden's deepest truth. We are creatures who need our monsters. We craft them when they don't exist. We preserve them even when we know they're false. We return to them again and again, not for historical accuracy, but for psychological necessity. The Iron Maiden satisfies something in us that facts and documentation cannot touch. It gives evil a face, a shape, a containment. It lets us be horrified at a safe distance. It provides darkness we can walk away from. And maybe that's why we built it. Not to remember medieval cruelty, but to forget modern complicity. Not to preserve history, but to invent a past so dark our present seems bright by comparison. Not to honor victims, but to create suffering we can contemplate without guilt. The Iron Maiden is a confession we don't realize we're making. Today, Iron Maidens stand in museums from London to Tokyo, from Nuremberg to New York. Each one is a copy of a fabrication. Each one draws crowds. Each one inspires the same hushed horror. Each one does its work, and that work is not historical education. It's psychological consolation. It tells us humanity was once worse than this. It tells us we have progressed. It tells us the darkness is behind us, not within us, not around us. It tells us evil is extraordinary, exceptional, ancient. It tells us we could never, we are different. The Iron Maiden is the most successful piece of propaganda ever created, precisely because no one thinks of it as propaganda at all. I want you to imagine something with me. 500 years from now, there's a museum. In it stands a device. The curator explains it was used in the early 21st century for torture. It's a chair, they say, where victims were strapped and subjected to psychological torment. Images were projected, voices piped in, the human mind systematically broken through sensory manipulation. It's terrifying, they say. It's proof of how barbaric our ancestors were. Thank goodness we've evolved. But you know the truth. It was an airplane seat. It was uncomfortable, yes. Annoying, certainly, but not torture. Not designed for suffering, just poorly designed for humans. The future has mistaken discomfort for cruelty, inconvenience for malice, and built a horror from misunderstanding. That's what we've done with the Iron Maiden. We've taken fragments of real medieval punishment, mixed them with Gothic imagination, and created a monster that never existed. While the real monsters of that era and our own operate in forms too mundane to memorialize. So what do we do with this knowledge? We could demand museums remove the Iron Maidens, but that feels insufficient. The damage is done, the mythology is embedded. Removing the physical objects won't erase the cultural impact. We could add more context, better placards, clearer disclaimers. But who reads those? Who wants their dark thrill interrupted by academic nuance? Or we could do something more difficult. We could use the Iron Maiden as a mirror instead of a window. Every time we see it, every time we feel that comfortable horror, we could ask, what are we not seeing? What modern horrors are we ignoring while we fixate on invented medieval ones? What systems of suffering operate around us that we've normalized, bureaucratized, made invisible? The Iron Maiden could become not a relic of false history, but a reminder of true pattern. The pattern of humans creating acceptable darknesses to avoid confronting unacceptable ones. There's a story they tell in Nuremberg now, a different kind of ghost story. They say if you stand in front of where the original Iron Maiden used to be, before the bombing, before the destruction, you can still feel something. Not the presence of victims who never existed, but the weight of belief itself. The accumulated horror of millions of people imagining suffering that never occurred. Is collective imagination less real than individual experience? Is a myth believed by millions less powerful than a truth known by few? The Iron Maiden teaches us that reality is not always stronger than fiction. That sometimes we believe in darkness so completely that we manifest it. Not in the past where we pretend it lives, but in the present where we refuse to see it. The screams never happened, not in any Iron Maiden, not in medieval dungeons. Not in the ways we imagine, but screams happen every day. In immigration detention centers we don't tour, in prisons we don't memorialize, in wars we don't examine, in systems we don't question. The Iron Maiden's greatest trick isn't making us believe in historical torture. It's making us believe that torture looks like something from a museum. Extraordinary, elaborate, unmistakable. It doesn't, it looks like policy, like procedure, like necessity, like the way things have to be. The Iron Maiden is a lie that tells the truth. Just not the truth it claims to tell. It doesn't reveal medieval cruelty. It reveals modern denial. It doesn't preserve history, it performs erasure. It doesn't memorialize suffering, it compartmentalizes it, historicizes it, makes it safe to contemplate and easy to forget. In the end, the Iron Maiden is exactly what it appears to be, empty. There's nothing inside its metal shell. There never was. No victims, no blood, no history, just hollow darkness and our projections. But that emptiness is precisely what makes it so useful. We can fill it with whatever we need. Medieval barbarism, human capacity for evil, proof of progress, justification for our own moral certainty. The Iron Maiden is a blank screen onto which we project our need for simple, past-tense darkness. And in that projection, we reveal more about ourselves than we ever do about history. So here we are, at the end of this investigation, standing before a device that never did what we think it did, created by people who weren't who we imagined, for purposes we're only now beginning to understand. And the question isn't whether the Iron Maiden is real. Of course it's real, you can see it in museums, touch its cold metal, stand in its shadow. The question is, what is it real as, not a torture device, a story, a mirror, a distraction, a confession? A carefully constructed lie that we needed so badly it became more influential than truth. The Iron Maiden is the coffin where we buried our capacity for honest historical reckoning. And the screams we hear coming from inside it are our own, echoing back from the hollow metal, reminding us of all the suffering we chose not to see because we were too busy looking at a Victorian stage prop and calling it medieval truth. History remembers what we choose to preserve, and sometimes what we choose to preserve says more about us than about the past we claim to honor. The Iron Maiden stands in museums around the world, still silent, still empty, still doing its work, not revealing darkness, but concealing it, not educating us about cruelty, but comforting us with the illusion that cruelty is something from another time, another place, another people. And as long as we need that comfort more than we need truth, the coffin of screams will never be empty. We'll keep filling it with the convenient horrors we invented, while ignoring the inconvenient horrors we perpetuate. Some shadows are cast by objects that were never there, and sometimes those are the shadows that hide the most.